Hi, I'm Jan Chappuis, and I'm here today to talk to educators at University of Southern Maine and educators all over Southern Maine. I was a classroom teacher. I taught grades 4 through 9. I love teaching, and I moved into curriculum development because I knew that we needed more work on our curriculum. So I spent several years as a curriculum developer, and then I spent several years as a staff developer, focused first on teaching teachers how to teach writing. And then as I gained in my own expertise as in classroom assessment, I began teaching about how to do assessment well in the classroom. And eventually I began doing, let's start over.
Just go. Okay, if you want to start over, let's just restart.
Yeah. Okay.
And Jan, talk in a firm voice.
Okay.
Okay.
A little more.
Yes, you can do this.
Buck up.
Yes. Yeah, you're doing great. Just let it flow. And if you feel like you're starting to lose it, don't even worry. It's natural. Don't get too hung up on one take wonders. Just do it.
Okay. Okay. You're going to count me down. 3, 2, 1, go. Hi, I'm Jan Chappuis, and I'm here today to talk to educators at University of Southern Maine and educators throughout all of Southern Maine. I was a classroom teacher. I taught grades 4 through 9, and then I moved into curriculum development and staff development, working first teaching teachers how to teach writing, and then on how to do classroom assessment well. So I love teaching, and when I was a classroom teacher, I loved teaching, and I hated assessment. I felt that I was giving with the teaching hand and taking away with the assessment hand. With the teaching hand, I was nurturing learning. Kids were enjoying school. They were engaged in activities that motivated them. And then, boom, here comes assessment. And it seemed to really be Bambi meets Godzilla. Everything that I'd done with teaching seemed to be undone with assessing. Now, I had a pretty tenuous connection in my mind between teaching and assessment when I was a beginning teacher. Many of us see assessment this way, as something that happens after teaching. It's learning neutral at best and harmful to students at worst. For me, and for many teachers, assessment was all about the grade. So we have assessment, and all of our assessment practices lead to grading. However, it turns out that what I didn't like about assessment had a lot to do with what I didn't know about assessment. And as I grew as a teacher, I learned more about how to do assessment right and how to use it well. And it turned out that a lot of what I didn't like was due to the fact that I didn't know how to do assessment right, so I ended up with inaccurate information, which was harmful to students. And then I also didn't know how to use the assessment results in any way other than to grade. So we're going to talk today about really the concept of assessment literacy. The concept of assessment literacy has 2 parts to it. Do it right, use it well, make sure we know how to gather accurate information, and then that we can use it not just to measure learning, but also to nurture learning, to support learning. So that's really, in a nutshell, what I didn't know how to do and what many teachers don't know how to do. Over the course of the last 20 years, I've been involved in writing books and in giving presentations to help teachers develop assessment literacy. One of the books is Classroom Assessment for Student Learning, Doing It Right, Using It Well. Co-authored with Rick Stiggins, my husband Steve Chappuis, and Judy Arter. And the other book is 7 Strategies of Assessment for Learning. And the content of what I'll be sharing with you this morning comes from these 2 books. So we can get started here with our presentation. Let's look at assessment literacy. Assessment literacy can really be captured by 5 keys to assessment quality: the accuracy part and the effective use part. So the first key to assessment quality is clear purpose. And that is, do we know who's going to use the information and how will they use it? And if all we do with an assessment is grade, then if that's all we know how to do, then we are missing one half of the clear purpose key to quality, and that is there are things we can do with assessment besides grade. Once we understand the different purposes for assessment, then we can move to key 2 clear targets. Key 2 clear targets simply means that before I set out to design an assessment or administer it, I need to be clear about what learning targets I'm teaching to. And then I need to design an assessment to make sure that the assessment actually measures what I taught. So that's key 3, sound design. And in key 3, sound design, we look at, have I chosen an assessment method that matches the target I intend to teach? Have I created that assessment with standards of quality in mind? Different assessments have different standards of quality. And so in the accuracy side, we have 3 keys: clear purpose, clear target, and sound design. And we need to know we need to develop assessment competencies in each one of those 3 keys in order to ensure that our data is accurate. And then we move over to the effective use side. Now, the effective use side, we have effective communication. Grading fits there, certainly. Summative communication is about grading. And when we've done grading well and formative assessment well, where we are looking at using the results and communicating the results for formative purposes, we first go to, we look at purpose. And if you could advance the slide, you'll see we have a little arrow there. There we go. So key 4, effective communication, really begins with what's my purpose for assessment, therefore, how am I going to communicate the information? And then we move from effective communication to clear targets. Am I sure that I am communicating about the targets that I'm teaching? Do my grades and my feedback and all of my communication reflect achievement on valued learning targets? The third consideration is, have my assessments been designed so they can support the communication I need to do? If it is tended to be formative, are my assessments designed with instructional traction in mind so they help me determine what to do next? If it is summative, is the design set up so that I can translate my results into a standards-based grade? The last key to quality on the effective use side is student involvement. And student involvement is really about each one of the other 4 keys to quality. So if you could advance the slide, we'll see that we have an arrow that connects student involvement and clear purpose. So with student involvement, we ask in clear purpose, have we thought about the student as an assessment user? When we ask the question, who's going to use the information and how will they use it, is the student one of our intended users? And then with clear targets, have we made the targets clear to students? Without clear targets, without students understanding the target, we can't provide effective feedback. They certainly can't self-assess and set goals. And it turns out that we lose a lot of motivation to learn if we skip the step of helping students understand what it is they're supposed to learn. And then with student involvement and key 3, sound design, we think about designing, if students are intended users of the assessment results, then how do we design our assessments so that students can look at their own results and say, here's what I'm good at, here's what I've mastered, and here's what I still need to work on. So have we considered in our design of our assessments the use that the students might make of them in terms of self-assessment and setting goals? And then last, in effective communication, not only do we want our effective communication to students in the form of feedback to encourage further learning, but we want students to be able to track their own learning, to reflect on it, and then to share it as well. So that is our five key structure for assessment competencies that we need to have in place in order to have an assessment literate culture. Many of these concepts were missing from my own personal practice, and I think that in large part that is one of the reasons that I did not enjoy assessment at all. And if you can think back to your own experiences as an assessor in the classroom, most of us did not go into teaching in order to assess. Most of us do not generally put the words assessment and joy in the same sentence. Most of us think about assessment as something that happens, that teaching might be able to happen without assessment. And it turns out that teaching can happen without assessment, but learning doesn't happen so well without assessment. So we're going to look a bit at effective summative use as an example of how these 5 keys to quality are necessary for anything we intend to do with assessment results. So let's use standards-based grading as our example, because standards-based grading is something that we know we want teachers to be able to do with assessment information. It turns out that standards-based grading is not isn't accomplished by teaching people how to do standards-based grading. How do we do standards-based grading really hinges on, do we know how to track learning by standard? So in order to do standards-based grading, we need to be able to track our students' learning target or content standard by content standard. Standards-based tracking relies on a foundation of standards-based assessment. If our assessments are not aligned directly to the content standards we're teaching to, then we won't be having an assessment that reflects the standards student had opportunity to learn, and we won't be able to track by standard. We'll be stuck tracking by category or just tracking grades in a subject. Standards-based assessment relies on a foundation of standards-based teaching. Now, this doesn't always happen. We often have standards-based assessments that have been prepared and teachers administer them, but they may not be a direct match to the teaching. And when that happens, we have assessment results that don't reflect what students had opportunity to learn. And if we use those results and create a grade, then we have graded kids on things that they didn't practice or didn't learn. So standards-based grading requires standards-based tracking, which requires standards-based assessment, which is best done in conjunction with standards-based teaching. And standards-based teaching requires standards-based planning. In order to teach to the standards, I need to be able to plan with those standards, to look at those standards and say, how can I take them apart so that they are at the lesson level? What am I going to do first? What am I going to do next? What are the students going to practice? So at the standards-based planning stage, we're really deconstructing the content standards so that students we're able to not just say, okay, here's this huge content standard and this is what we're going to learn. And then we don't really have a roadmap to how to get there. So standards-based planning is really about creating that roadmap that gets us to the attainment of the ultimate content standard. Standards-based planning hinges on having a clear understanding of the content standards. So you can see here that standards-based grading isn't just an effective use strategy or competency. It really relies on a foundation of clear targets, as does all assessment. So standards-based grading requires assessment literacy in order to get there. Now, on the formative side, when we look at the formative side of assessment, effective formative use. So we're still in key 4, effective use of information, effective communication, and we're thinking about the formative side of it. Now, as you know, and as many researchers have been sharing with us over several decades, formative assessment practice into 3 categories. Basically, when we are assessing for formative purposes, we have one of 3 possible uses of that information. And the first one is to figure out where students are in their learning in order to know what we're going to do next to increase that learning. Where are their strengths, where are their problems, and what are we going to do about it? Many of the practices that you're familiar with that fall under the banner of formative assessment are whiteboards, clickers, data-driven decision-making. Those fit into that category. However, there are other categories of high-impact formative assessment practices that involve the student more directly. And the first one is, as I'm sure you're familiar with, that we need to make sure we're providing effective feedback to students during the learning that offers guidance on how to improve. Now, in the research on feedback and how it can improve student learning, it isn't the giving of feedback that causes the gains. It's the acting on feedback that causes the gains. So we need to make sure when we are in the formative assessment side of the equation that we're providing enough time not only to give that feedback, but for students to act on it. No action, no gain. And the last category is developing student self-assessment and peer feedback skills. Much research has focused on the value of helping students to self-assess, to look at where they are, what am I good at, what do I need to work on, and also to work with their peers on collaboratively talking about their work and saying, what does this show I know, where do I have something mastered, and where are the areas that I need to take next steps. So that's our equation really for, or the three high impact categories of formative assessment. So we have on the one hand, on effective use, we have on the one hand, we have making sure that our grades are communicating effectively. And on the other hand, we have making sure that when we are using assessments formatively, that we are moving beyond just looking at the data to taking action, both ourselves and our students. When we put the teacher and the student action together, we can think about formative assessment in terms of 7 strategies. So 7 strategies of assessment for learning are structured around three key questions intended to gain the maximum learning out of our assessment practices. For the first category, where am I going, we have 2 strategies. And those, if we could advance the slide, those 2 strategies are to make sure students understand what the learning is and to use examples and models both of strong and weak work to help students get a clearer vision of what excellence looks like and doesn't look like. When teachers use these 2 strategies in advance of offering feedback or having students self-assess, they discover that student work comes in at a higher level of quality right from the get-go. And then we move to where am I now, and we have 2 strategies for that. The first one is offering regular descriptive feedback during the learning. And that one really hinges on having students understand the learning. A lot of the research on the effectiveness of feedback points to when feedback isn't effective, it actually harms learning. And one of the foundations for effective feedback is that students understand the intended learning. Without that, feedback does not help move them forward. And the second, or the fourth strategy, second in where am I now, is to have students self-assess and set goals for next steps. And then in this strategy, we actually ask students to do what we've just done with descriptive feedback. With our feedback, we've said, here's what's working, here's what's next. And we want students to be able to do that too. So we model self-assessment and goal setting through our descriptive feedback. And then we turn that over to students because we don't want to be their feedback givers for life. We need them to develop that capability in order to be self-reflective, self-reliant, self-regulating learners. Now these four strategies are sequential. Strategy 4 is a destination, and strategies 1 through 3 are enablers. We teach students with strategies 1 through 3 in order to prepare them to self-assess. When we look at the last category, how can I close the gap? We are really looking at 3 strategies that are what I call floaters. And that means that they can be used any time. You don't need to wait until you finish strategy 4 in order to begin strategy 5. Strategies 5 and 6 ask us to look at what students have done after they have done some work, determine what the learning needs are, and then and then teach to them with a number of different strategies, one of which might be to reteach, another might be to offer feedback, another, if students are ready, might be to ask them to look at their own work and decide what needs to happen. So we diagnose followed by action, and that's strategies 5 and 6. And then strategy 7 asks us to engage students in tracking, paying attention to their own growth, reflecting on how far they've come. I have become better at math this year. I used to, but now I have become a better writer this year. I have become a better reader this year. Here are the things I learned from doing this project. Here's what I didn't know at the beginning. Here's what I know now. Highly motivational, and also a great contributor to moving short-term memory information into the long-term memory. And then the last thing we ask them to do is, once they've tracked and reflected on their learning progress, to give them the opportunity to share them, to celebrate. So those are the 7 strategies of assessment for learning, and they are intended to capture the effective use side, the formative components of the effective use side. And you can see the 3 high-impact formative assessment practices embedded here in strategies 3, 4, and then 5 and 6. So, if we're going to develop a culture of assessment in support of learning in our classrooms, we need both do it right, which is clear purpose plus clear targets plus sound design, and use it well. And that is, we need to make sure that our summative grading practices are in good shape, but also that our formative assessment practices, including involving the student in formative assessment, are in place. And that's what the 2 books, Classroom Assessment for Student Learning and 7 Strategies of Assessment for Learning, are designed to support. So we encourage people to think about those 2 books as their key texts in helping people helping teachers look at, what do I know, what am I good at, and what are my next steps in learning to make sure that I have a culture of assessment in support of learning in my classroom. Now, we're going to move to thinking about what are some barriers to teachers being able to move from assessment is all about the grade to assessment is about the learning. After teachers have delivered instruction and after students have completed an assignment, what generally happens in classrooms in your schools? Well, I'm going to go back to my own classroom as an example. I'm sure this does not happen in your schools, but you may be familiar with this model from your own past practice or past practice of others. In my pre-service program, when I was prepared to teach a few years ago, I was prepared to plan for teaching, defined as the act of instructing. I was taught different ways to deliver information and engage students in learning activities. I wasn't prepared to respond to student work. The only response I was prepared to give was a grade. So I, like many other teachers, began my career with a repertoire of 3 steps: plan, instruct, assign, and grade. First, I prepared materials and resources. Next, I did what I planned, and they did what I planned. And last, I graded what they did. However, learning turned out to be far messier than I was prepared to expect. Somewhere between I taught it and they learned it, somewhere between assign and grade, the straight shot downstream to mission accomplished diverged into a surprising array of tributaries, as is shown on this next slide. Over the course of my first year of teaching, I discovered there are about 1,000 ways to not get a lesson. So what went wrong? Why didn't it work right? It was supposed to work that way. I asked myself that over and over again. Well, it turns out that the landscape in the classroom between assign and grade is prime learning landscape. Nothing actually went wrong. The belief underpinning my teacher preparation and the belief underpinning much of what we bring to assessment today is that learning trots along right after good instruction. It's sort of a stimulus response system, which instruction plus assessment alone will create learning. The error here is that the path of plan, instruct, assign, and grade doesn't anticipate or plan for instructional correctives, which are a normal flow of attaining mastery in any field. I was planning for instruction, I was planning for meaningful and engaging activities, and I was planning for grading. Although I thought I was, it turned out I wasn't planning for learning. It turns out that whether learning occurs is determined by the steps we and our students take after instruct and assign. New Zealand researcher John Hattie calls this the zone of what happens next and describes it as a feedback loop. As a matter of fact, he says, the act of teaching reaches its epitome of success after we've delivered the content, after we've organized everything. The art of teaching and its major successes relate to what happens next. So if we look at this next slide, this is what John Hattie calls the feedback loop. I would call it the formative assessment loop. And I think it's crucial to understanding the importance of assessment to learning. We have initial instruction, student action, and then instead of moving to grade, students and teachers look at the work to analyze the learning need. And if perchance learning has happened, we have attained mastery at that point, then we can move to grade. However, chances are for many students, we have not yet attained mastery. So our next step is to look at that work, and then, if we're going to go forward here, and then perhaps we notice that there's something that our students just didn't understand, and we need to reteach. So we reteach, and then we don't move directly to grade. We move back to letting students take action on the teaching, and then looking at that, and then perhaps we're ready to grade, or maybe we're ready to give feedback to students on their work at that point. Or maybe students have taken action, we look at that initially, and we realize that they have partial understanding, they have partial mastery, and feedback is a good teaching strategy at this point. Or perhaps they're ready to offer each other feedback, or to assess their own work. So we've got those three high-impact formative assessment practices represented here. And if we simply teach along plan, instruct, assign, and grade, we don't have any room for this feedback loop. We don't have any room for formative assessment practices. And this is what happens when teachers say, I think formative assessment is really important, but I don't have time. What we don't have time for is the learning part of teaching when we don't have time for the feedback loop. At this point, our last step is then to move toward grading. This, because it's often not a straight shot from instruction to mastery, good teaching includes planning ways to keep learning moving forward in the space between assign and grade. Now, let's go back to John Hattie for just a minute by going forward. John Hattie wrote a book called, I'm going to pull it up here, in 2009, wrote a book called Visible Learning. That's probably backwards, but it says Visible Learning. And in that book, he synthesized over 800 meta-analyses of influences on student achievement, 146,000 effect sizes, 52,000 studies, millions of students, 15 years of work, and 138 separate factors that could influence student achievement were analyzed. And in that work, he says, actually, one conclusion that he drew, and that is from actually this book, Visible Learning for Teachers, which he wrote in 2012 or so. to synthesize this information for teachers, he said the single most important factor that a teacher can bring to the classroom to influence students' learning is their desire to seek disconfirming evidence. In other words, instead of looking at student work and saying, oh no, we're never going to meet the accountability requirements this year, to look at student work and say, gee, this is why I have a job. Let's look at what needs to be done. The most crucial factor in helping students learn is the teacher's desire or willingness to seek disconfirming evidence. Now, what do we do between assign and grade? Well, often we think we're going to get learning by motivating assignment completion by saying it's worth points. So that's often what happens in that very important landscape between assign and grade. Now, if we think about that, though, we may have misconstrued a very important connection between assign and grade. So if we can move to the next slide. This is an example, a gardening example, of that way of thinking about motivating learning. How does that work? Not very well. If you can move to the next slide, we'll see that threats of accountability don't grow vegetables or learning. Now, accountability is our main way of motivating learning. However, we're going to look at a little bit of research on what happens to learning when accountability is what we hold over students as why they need to do their work. This is a quote from Terry Crooks. Actually, Dylan William is quoting Terry Crooks in a book called The Sage Handbook on Research on Classroom Assessment. And hang on, I'll pull that one up too. Looks like this, Sage Handbook on Research on Classroom Assessment. And in this book, Dylan William wrote a chapter called Feedback and Instructional Correctives. And he's looking at what happens when everything that we do is graded. And so he went back to Terry Crooks' research, and Terry Crooks noticed that our assessment practices are heavy on the accountability side and light on the nurturing learning side. So Dylan William drew these conclusions from Terry Crooks' research, which are on the next slide. Too much summative assessment causes these things. Reducing students' desire to learn for the sake of learning, to do their work because they're learning. Increase in test anxiety, which turns out to suck up a lot of the working memory, which means you do worse on your test when you have high anxiety because you can't remember what you need to remember. Increased ability attributions for success and failure, and those when we have an ability attribution for our success or our failure, that means that we are believing that we have succeeded because we're smart, or we have failed because we are not smart. Those of you who are familiar with Carol Dweck's work will recognize her mindset theory in there. So when students encounter, when all of their assessments are graded, it has a tendency to cause them to believe that kids who are smart do well, and kids who aren't smart don't do well, because there isn't any room for learning. Which leads to lowered self-efficacy, the sense that they can actually do anything about it in our struggling students. It reduces the impact of feedback. Students are less likely to pay attention to feedback when the work is graded. And it causes poorer social relationships among students. They are less able to learn in a collaborative mode or to see themselves as all engaged together in the same endeavor. So Dylan William goes on to say this, and that's on the next slide. If learning is a predictable process, in which most of the time proceeds as planned, which seemed to be what was underlying my teacher preparation, instructional correctives will be rarely needed. And when they are needed, they are a sign that something has gone wrong. Students generally will learn what they've been taught, but every once in a while they won't. And he goes on the next slide, to say this. Well, he doesn't. What we have here is a little. Go ahead and we'll look at this one. So when we think about the predictable process piece, it's the stimulus response again. What we have is I teach, they learn. A lot like you hit the knee with the hammer and the leg kicks forward, but it doesn't turn out to be a stimulus response relationship between teaching and learning. So now, but that's really the model that's the assumption that this model is built on. Dillon goes on to say this on the next slide. In this view, feedbacks and instructional correctives are pathological aspects of instruction. Now you can just envision a pathology, which is a pathological agent would be something like like E. coli, that there's something dreadfully wrong when students don't get it. But Dillon goes on to say this as well. If learning is an unpredictable process, and we have to believe that it is based on our experience teaching and our own experience learning, then feedback and instructional correctives are central to learning. Indeed, go ahead and advance. Without them, little effective instruction can take place. So, if that is true, then no wonder we move from a sign to lots of different things that need to be addressed. But if we don't understand that, then all we do is push on to the grade. This is a child who has failed at eating. Over 50% of the food has not gone into her mouth. Yet, she doesn't quit. Very few students give up, very few children give up on their learning how to eat. Would grading her help her move on? No. Allowing her to practice with feedback. Eventually, we're going to introduce the concept of, let's say plate. And then we're going to move into perhaps utensil. And then at some point we'll move to napkin. But this requires practice with feedback and with time to learn. Anything difficult, which is what our content standards are to most of our students. Anything difficult to learn deserves opportunity to grow, not just present, practice, grade. We want our students to come to our classrooms understanding that error is an essential part of learning, and that when they have made mistakes, their goal is to learn from them. And I think that's captured in this quote, I will make better mistakes tomorrow. Now, if we go back to the teaching and the connection between teaching and assessment, if we have a tenuous connection between teaching and assessment at best, and if we think about assessment as really what happens after teaching, then all we're left with being able to do with assessment is grade, which is that slide we'll see again that we saw last time. That the whole domain of assessment is about accountability and about grading. We have some learning problems that I'm sure you can imagine that are caused when this is our whole view of assessment, and they are represented on the next slide. Struggling students give up too soon. Grading everything works against students' desire to improve learning. If it has a grade, and the grade isn't high enough, they'll work to improve the grade, but they can do work without doing learning. And unfortunately, sometimes they can improve their grade without having improved their learning. And it also puts too much emphasis on the accountability end of things and not enough emphasis on how do we learn and what does it take to learn. So it works against developing a culture in the classroom where learning is the most important thing going on. And that's illustrated in these two quotes. Claire is my daughter, she's 14. She came home from her first week in her 9th grade English class, and she said, I'm doomed. All of my mistakes count against me. And I said to her, It's okay, honey. You do the work, you do the learning, and the grade will follow. And she looked me straight in the eye and she said, only a fool believes that, Mom. And she was right. And her classroom was not set up so that she could do the work, do the learning, improve, and have the grade reflect that. When we grade everything, all of our mistakes count against us. And you can see what that will do to the struggling student. Contrast that with the slide. Go ahead back for a minute here. Back to the slide we were on. Thanks. Contrast that to the little sign. I made this sign my first year of teaching. It was on a sentence strip. And sentence strips, those of you who have worked in elementary, they have a certain length to them. And I wrote it, and every time I wrote it, I ran out of room for room. And I got a little farther each time. But I finally just gave up on this was my last effort, and posted it because they decided this side showed what it was trying to tell. It's okay to make mistakes in this room. The important thing is to get farther each time. A friend of mine who teaches middle school science says on testing day is a great day to be right. Every other day is a great day to be wrong. Because how do we know what we need to learn if we aren't able to look at it? John Hattie says this as one of the conclusions from those millions of students and thousands of effect sizes. The primary purpose of maintaining a classroom that is warm, trustworthy, and empathetic is to allow learning to thrive on error. An essential element in the classroom, then, is to make sure that we have ground rules that create a safe harbor for welcoming error and thence learning. And then 3 researchers who have written a book that I'm reading right now, actually, or I've just finished reading, Brown, Rudiger, and McDaniel, say this, and I'll show you the book. It's called Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning. And in this book, they're looking at how do we move short-term memory learning into the long-term memory. And they talk a lot about practice and about self-assessment and about strategies that help students remember. And they say this, the qualities of persistence and resiliency, in which failure are seen as useful information, underlie successful innovation everywhere, and they lie at the core of nearly all successful learning. So what do we need to do? We need to make sure that after we instruct, after students have taken action, we have a look at that work. Now let's move to the next slide. And we do something about it. We look at it first, and then we do something. Now our action can be, go ahead, further instruction, if needed. If students have got at least a halfway decent grip on the learning, then we can offer feedback. So offering feedback is another action we might take. And if students have a sense of what their strengths and weaknesses are, we can ask them to have a look at that and set goals for next steps. So it isn't just a matter of look at it, and then I don't have the time, so I'm going to grade. It's actually a matter of taking the time, understanding what learning requires, and giving students the opportunity to practice with feedback. So if we'll go to our next slide. Learning something well requires practice with feedback and interventions. Students not knowing isn't a problem, it's a profession. So when we want our teachers, when we want to honor that our teachers care about student learning, they care about whether or not students are succeeding in their classrooms, we need to think about what aspects of assessment literacy do it right and use it well. Which aspects do we need to help them develop a better understanding of? We call that deepening assessment expertise. It's doable as long as it's not rushed. If we treat it as a get or done, all right, we got to get this done because that needs to be fixed, we will not give it enough time. It's not done through workshops or speakers. but through sustained study, practice, and implementation over time. If you think about the feedback loop, if you think about assessment for learning practices, if you think about giving instruction to teachers, what do we do after we teach something to teachers? Do we just move on and assume they've mastered it? Or do we build that formative assessment loop, the learning time, into our professional development experiences as well? It's not an initiative. It's ongoing multi-year work. It's the work of a professional career. Good assessment is good teaching. Thank you.
Voila.
Voila.
Wow, awesome.
How much time was that? Like an hour? 45 minutes?
I think it was close to 40 minutes. Let me just go check. I'll go look at the tab. I'd say it was 45.
Okay, well, when I did it for practice, it was 30, so I must have been throwing a bunch of stuff in there. Or holding the books up might have been a little weird.
Well, no.